Hello, my name is Catherine Foley and I'm going to read today from my book Beyond the Breakwater, and today's chapter is 52, Guatemala. The minibus drove us as high up the mountain as it could go. Then we walked. The path wound steeply up through tall trees. Through the branches we could see other mountains rearing up into the sky, ranged around us at every point. It was hot. From the air you might have seen vivid slashes of bright green and orange earth. We climbed up to a small Mayan village on a level with the highest peaks. I was in Guatemala with a group of journalists who had been invited by Trocara, the Irish charity and overseas development agency, to visit some of the places where its volunteers were working, so that we could report on its campaign to seek justice for the country's indigenous Mayan people. It was quiet in the tiny, grieving Guatemalan village of Xcots. The ground was covered with soft clay, so all movement was hushed. The bare feet of children and their parents walking along earthen lanes left only the smallest imprint. We saw the earth squish beneath them, and we followed in our sturdy boots. All sounds were dulled as we made our way to the little church. A cock yodeled on a post, alerting us to the coming of night. And then the darkness fell quickly, blanketing us until we had to grope our way along a path. Still, looking up high above us, we could see that the sky was clear and the stars were twinkling in an inky universe where there were no electric lights. We went into the roughly built chapel where many of the local people had already gathered. Great big eyes watched us from the pews when we sat on the benches on the right-hand side of the chapel. There were whispers in the dim light. Little boys, some with swollen bellies, stood nearby, pressed in close to their mothers. 3 men strummed on guitars in a corner, their music thin and scratchy. They seemed out of tune, jangling and weak, with no melody and no strength behind their hymns. Mayan families were in the process of saying goodbye to the family members who'd disappeared during the Civil War. The ceremony that was due to finish before the sun came up. The bodies had only recently been discovered, exhumed from a mass grave. Now they were to be given a proper burial at dawn, and we'd been invited by Trocara to witness the ceremony on the understanding that we would write about it or film it, thereby drawing attention to it in the wider world and also highlighting the plight of these people who had endured terrible brutality and injustice throughout the war of genocide perpetrated against them from 1960 to 1996. When we were there in the mid-2000s, the Maya people were in the process of bringing the perpetrators of that genocide to court, and Trocara was helping them to achieve this. Many horrific things happened during the genocide in Guatemala. For example, during 1981 and 1982, the army and paramilitary groups murdered 100,000 people. As we travelled through the country and interviewed various individuals, I sometimes felt that we were intruding on their grief, and I worried that we had no right to quiz these people who were there to answer our questions about their experiences of having lost their families or been raped or beaten. But they told us that they wanted us to witness and report on their suffering, and I still remember how they looked at us and explained that it was important that we were there. And so we all huddled close on the benches as the vigil continued, us Westerners trying to understand what they'd been through. It was a night to think about souls. It was an Ihan Amarov, a night of the dead, one to remember forever. The church felt like an old-fashioned schoolroom. All 33 coffins were light-coloured, small, newly made, still rough and sticky from the sap seeping from the light wooden structures. They were piled high in rows, one on top of another. The shaman, a thin man in narrow white pants and a dark purple coat, swung a thurible, and the sweet smell of incense filled the space as the sad empty night wore on. Sometime before the sun came up, the men stopped playing their instruments and joined others to carry the coffins outside. They went down the side of the mountain towards a long communal grave they'd dug, where they would bury the bodies of 33 loved ones from their community. Us journalists follow the procession of mourners, toddlers, old people, young boys, young girls. There were solemn faces. They seemed weary, too spent to cry. As they gathered along the top of the trench, we saw the dawn breaking and the sun's first rays begin to peep over the distant horizon. The ceremony began, and the dark nearby peaks began to change, turning a pinky orange, blushing. The dim light spread. Now it began to change to yellow, and the light lit up the trench. The ochre clay was piled in heaps, and the gash in the earth was red and glistening, opening like a wound. The shaman stood on a rise and swung the thurible again and again as the sun rose. The musicians started another scratchy hymn, strumming those loose strings. Their great trilby hats looked as worn as their eyes. More men, all thin and small-boned, their wide-brimmed hats stark against the red clay, got into the trench and started taking the coffins from those on top, trying not to jolt them. No one spoke as the boxes were passed from one to the other. Some boxes fell awkwardly. Once all the coffins had been placed in the trench, the men climbed out and began shoveling in the red clay. It was nearly over. The shaman then, standing on a pile of red earth, chanted softly. It sounded like he was saying a decade of the rosary. The incense from his thurible wafted back and forth, a smudge of lilac against a white sky. We hung our heads low, trying to imagine what terrible events had happened in Guatemala to leave them so cleat martial, so defeated like this, so broken. So a sort of a sad piece today, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed it and thank you for listening, and talk again tomorrow. Bye now.